She fell to her knees begging, "Take me as your woman, I have nowhere else," expecting only pity or rejection. But when he wrapped her in his arms and whispered, "You're safe," it made folks wonder what kind of man offers love to someone the world gave up on. The storm hits Montana territory like God's own fury, turning the prairie into a churning sea of mud and lightning. Rain hammers against Calder Breyer's ranch house as he sits by the fireplace, mending a broken bridle with patient precision. The banging on his barn door cuts through the thunder like a desperate prayer. Calder sets down his leather work and reaches for the oil lamp. He's 34, but the lines around his eyes speak of sorrows beyond his years. Moving with careful deliberation, he pulls on his coat and steps into the storm. The rain soaks through his clothes in seconds. Lightning illuminates the prairie, and there, huddled against his barn door like a broken bird, is a woman. She's barely more than a shadow wrapped in threadbare rags. Her dark hair hangs in wet tangles around a face marked by exhaustion and terror. When she looks up, her eyes hold horrors no woman should endure. "Please," she whispers, barely audible above the storm's roar. "I have nothing left to give you, nothing to trade. But take me as your woman. I have nowhere else to go." The words carry desperation so raw it takes his breath away. This isn't desire or necessity. This is someone offering the only thing she believes she has left. Calder doesn't hesitate. He kneels in the mud beside her and wraps his warm coat around her trembling shoulders. His voice carries gentle authority. "You're safe now," he tells her, and means every word. If this story grips your heart, don't forget to comment and share your thoughts below. You won't believe what happens next. Calder lifts the woman carefully, feeling how she trembles with exhaustion beneath the sodden fabric. She weighs almost nothing too light, speaking to deep deprivation. Inside, warmth hits them like an embrace. He sets her by the fireplace where orange light can chase the death chill from her bones. Moving with practiced efficiency, he drapes his warmest blanket around her shoulders. "Here," he says. "This'll help." She accepts the blanket but refuses the bowl of stew he offers, eyes darting like a cornered animal. Everything about her screams of someone who's learned that kindness comes with terrible prices. Calder recognizes that look from wounded soldiers who'd been betrayed, from beaten animals that couldn't distinguish help from harm. He retreats to his chair, giving her space while maintaining quiet presence. The townspeople call him the silent rancher, and they're not wrong. Calder's always been a man of few words, but his reticence deepened after the war. He'd served as cavalry medic during the brutal final years, patching up boys who should have been courting girls instead of dying in muddy fields. War taught him that healing often happened in spaces between words, in gentle pressure of capable hands, and demonstrated safety that could never be declared. His wife Mary had understood that. She'd been the only woman who could coax laughter from his serious nature. When fever took her 3 winters ago, Calder retreated further into himself, finding solace with horses and cattle who didn't expect conversation. The woman shifts slightly, and he sees her face clearly. She's younger than expected, maybe 25, with features that would be beautiful without exhaustion and pain. There's purple bruising along her jaw and a small scar on her chin from childhood. Her hands shake, even wrapped in his blanket. "What's your name?" he asks gently. For long moments, she doesn't answer. When she finally speaks, her voice is barely a whisper, as if speaking her name might summon pursuing demons. "Nella," she says. "Nella Rowan." "I'm Calder Breyer, and you're welcome here, Nella Rowan, for as long as you need." The promise hangs between them, made without conditions. Outside, the storm continues, but inside, 2 broken souls find peace in shared names and warmth. Dawn breaks gray over the Montana prairie, the storm having spent its fury. Calder wakes to find Nella still curled by the fireplace, breathing shallow but steady in exhausted sleep. In pale morning light, he sees what shadows had hidden: finger-shaped bruises on her wrists, a split lip trying to heal, scratches on her neck disappearing beneath her collar. Calder's seen enough violence to read the story written on her skin. Something cold and hard settles in his chest, but he doesn't ask questions. Some stories need offering, not demanding. He moves quietly through his morning routine, starting coffee and preparing eggs and biscuits. The familiar rhythm helps calm the anger that wants to rise. Nella stirs as coffee smell fills the air, eyes opening with sudden alertness, someone who's learned to wake ready for danger. Confusion flickers across her features as she takes in clean walls, comfortable furniture, the absence of threat. "Morning," Calder says simply. "Coffee's almost ready." She sits up slowly, wincing. "I should go. I've imposed long enough." "Where would you go?" The question is gentle but direct. Nella's silence is answer enough. She rises unsteadily, determined to leave despite having nowhere safe. Pride the last refuge of someone who's lost everything else. "I'll find somewhere," she insists, moving toward the door with careful steps. "I won't be a burden." She makes it 3 steps outside before her knees buckle. Fever, held at bay by warmth and rest, reasserts itself with vengeance. Calder catches her before she hits the ground. "Nella," he says urgently, lifting her back inside. "You're burning up." He carries her to his bed and begins the careful work of nursing fever. Cool cloths, water for dehydration, blankets when chills overtake her despite the heat. "You don't owe me anything," he whispers during a lucid moment. "You just rest. Let yourself heal." In delirium, she cries out fragments that paint pictures of terror. A man's name surfaces repeatedly. "Silas, please, no more." The way she says it, with soul-deep terror, tells Calder everything about why she ran. For 3 days, he tends her with infinite patience. On the 4th morning, her fever breaks. Nella wakes clear-eyed for the first time and sees Calder asleep in the chair beside her bed, exhausted from constant care. The sight moves her to tears she didn't know she had left. Word travels fast in Dustmere, where everyone knows their neighbor's business. By the time Nella can sit up, half the town knows Calder Breyer has taken in a woman, and the gossip mill grinds with ruthless efficiency. At Henderson's General Store, speculation flows freely. "Saw her through his kitchen window," reports Edna Marsh, the banker's wife. "Thin as a rail, pale as milk. Looks like she's been through something terrible." Sheriff Tom Bradley finds himself fielding pointed questions about Calder's situation. When pressure becomes too much, he rides out to the ranch on a crisp morning. Calder meets him at the door, relaxed but alert. They've known each other for years. Tom was one of the few who'd welcomed Calder to Dustmere after the war. "Tom," Calder nods, stepping aside. "Coffee?" "Don't mind if I do." Tom settles into his usual chair. Through the kitchen doorway, he sees a woman moving quietly, preparing bread dough. She's thin but graceful, someone recovering rather than broken. "Got to ask, Calder," Tom says after pleasantries. "Some folks are getting worked up about your house guest. Want to make sure everything's proper." Calder's expression doesn't change, but something hardens around his eyes. "She's not a house guest, Tom. She's a woman who needed help, and I gave it. Last I checked, that wasn't against any law." "It's not," Tom agrees carefully. "But some don't take kindly to harboring runaways." "She's not a runaway," Calder's voice carries quiet authority. "She's a human being who deserves consideration." In the kitchen, Nella continues working efficiently but quietly, trying to stay invisible. It's a posture Tom's seen in women who've learned to fear attention. "I'm not trying to cause trouble," Tom says sincerely, "but if someone comes looking, then we'll deal with them," Calder replies. "Until then, she's under my protection." Tom leaves uncomfortable. Feeling trouble is already coming, the kind that follows desperate people and their secrets. Back in town, Nella's presence becomes heated debate. Charitable residents argue for Christian compassion, but others whisper about impropriety between an unmarried woman and bachelor. Meanwhile, Nella slowly emerges from her shell of fear. She helps with small tasks, feeding chickens, washing dishes, mending clothes. But loud noises still make her flinch, and she jumps when approached too quickly. The first sign Nella is truly healing comes on a Tuesday evening when autumn light slants golden through Calder's kitchen windows. They're sharing simple supper beef stew and cornbread that represents something precious in their careful world. Calder tells her about his morning's misadventures with a stubborn cow who decided the far pasture was preferable to barn safety. His delivery is characteristically dry, just straightforward recounting of a man who finds humor in life's frustrations. In the lamplight, the small scar on Nella's china childhood memento from falling off a fence rail catches the golden glow as she listens with growing amusement. "So there I am," he says, cutting cornbread with careful precision, knee-deep in mud, trying to convince 800 pounds of beef that she doesn't want to spend the night in a bog. And she looks at me with this expression. I swear she was laughing. It's not particularly funny objectively, but something about Calder's gentle self-deprecation and obvious affection for even contrary livestock strikes Nella as deeply amusing. The laugh that escapes is rusty from disuse, tentative like a bird testing wings after winter. But it's genuine, the first real joy she's allowed herself in longer than memory. Calder stops mid-sentence, staring with something approaching wonder. Her laughter transforms her entire face, chasing away haunting shadows. For a moment, she looks like the young woman she should be. "That's the first time I've heard you laugh," he says softly. The observation brings a blush, but she doesn't retreat. Instead, she finds herself really talking for the first time. "I used to laugh more," she admits. "Before everything changed. I was apprenticed to a midwife in Silver Creek, Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell. She taught me about bringing babies safely into the world. I thought I had a future there." She pauses, gathering courage. "Then Mrs. Hartwell died, and her nephew inherited everything, including her debts, including me." Calder sets down his fork, giving full attention. "Silas Vellon," she continues, the name falling like a curse. "He said I was part of the estate, that my contract made me his property. When I tried to leave, he made it clear that wasn't an option." "You're not property," Calder says with quiet intensity. "You never were. No person can own another." Outside, neither notices the figure watching from Tree-Linea man on horseback, who's been tracking a runaway for 3 weeks. Silas Vellon has found what he came for. But inside the warm kitchen, Nella feels something she'd thought lost forever: hope. The first sign their peaceful respite is ending comes when Nella notices her mother's rusted locket missing from the windowsill where she'd left it. The locket isn't valuable, just small brass with a faded photograph, but it's her last connection to life before servitude. "Calder," she calls, voice tight with concern. "Did you move my locket?" He appears, drying his hands, expression shifting to sharp attention when he sees fear creeping back into her eyes. "No," he says simply. "Show me." They search together, Calder methodical, Nella increasingly agitated. When Calder checks the window itself, he finds the answer scratches in wood around the frame, the latch forced from outside. "Someone was in here," he says grimly. Outside, the ground beneath her window tells its storyboot prints too large for either of them. Fresh prints, made during the night while they slept unaware. The tracks lead toward the tree line where they disappear among fallen leaves. But their message is clear. Someone has been watching, learning their routines. "He found me," Nella whispers, words barely audible but carrying absolute terror. "Silas found me." Calder's response is immediate. He spends the afternoon reinforcing the house, checking locks, securing every entry point. From his military trunk, he retrieves a small revolver, nothing fancy, but reliable. "I want you to carry this," he tells her, showing her how to load and fire. "Only if you have no other choice. If someone's trying to hurt you and I'm not here." Nella takes the gun with shaking hands. She's never held a weapon, never imagined herself capable of violence. But memories of Silas Vellon's hands, his threats and casual cruelty, make the small gun feel like a lifeline. "He won't stop," she tells Calder as they sit by the fire that evening, both listening to every sound the wind carries. "Silas doesn't give up on what he thinks belongs to him. He'll come, and he'll bring others." "Let him come," Calder replies, voice carrying quiet authority of someone who's faced armed enemies. "This is my land, my home, and you're under my protection." The night stretches long and tense, full of shadows that might hide watchers and sounds that could be wind or something more dangerous. Neither sleeps well, and when dawn finally breaks gray and cold, both know their time of peace is ending. Somewhere out there, Silas Vellon is planning his next move. The stranger rides into Dustmere on a crisp Thursday morning, his horse travel-worn, his saddle bearing marks of hard riding. He's a big man, well-dressed in expensive wool and leather that announces money and status. At Henderson's general store, he dismounts with careful precision and ties his horse with barely controlled impatience. The bell announces his arrival to Mrs. Henderson and her browsing customers. "Morning," he says, voice carrying cultured tones. "I'm looking for information about a woman who might have passed through. Young lady, maybe 25, honey brown eyes, small scar on her chin from a childhood accident. Goes by Nella Rowan." Mrs. Henderson's hands still on the fabric she'd been measuring. The description matches Calder's houseguest perfectly, but something about the stranger's manner sets off warning bells. "Don't recall anyone by that name," she lies smoothly. "Folks don't pass through much except when heading somewhere specific." The stranger's smile doesn't reach his eyes. "I should clarify my interest. My name is Silas Vellon, and the young woman is my legal ward. She's suffered some breakdown and ran away from her care facility. Her family is very worried." It's a smooth lie, delivered with practiced confidence, but Mrs. Henderson recognizes a predator regardless of expensive clothes. "Well, I hope you find her," she says with forced brightness. "Poor thing, being so confused." Vellon's jaw tightens at her failure to provide information. "If you should recall seeing anyone matching her description, I'd be grateful. There might be a reward for reuniting a lost girl with her family." He leaves his card and exits with frustrated air. Mrs. Henderson waits until he disappears before sending her son to find Sheriff Bradley. Word reaches Calder within hours, carried by Sheriff Bradley and town blacksmith Marcus Webb, a grizzled veteran who'd served with Calder during the war. They stand in Calder's kitchen while Nella hides in the back room, face pale with terror. "He's asking questions all over town," Sheriff Bradley reports grimly. "Claims he's her legal guardian, and she's mentally unstable. Some folks might believe him. But not the ones who matter," Marcus adds. "Mrs. Henderson sent word to decent folks. We know what's really happening." Nella emerges from the back room, face set with surprising determination. "I need to tell you everything about what Silas did, why I ran. You need to understand what kind of man you're dealing with." Her story strips away illusions. Silas Vellon isn't just someone who considers her property. He's a predator who's built wealth on others' suffering, using legal loopholes to maintain a stable of young women under domestic service. When Mrs. Hartwell died, he came to collect her assets, including me, Nella explains. "Said my apprenticeship transferred with her debts. When I tried to leave, he had me arrested for theft, claimed I'd stolen clothes and food. The judge was his friend." She gathers strength for the hardest part. "But it wasn't work he wanted. When I fought back, he locked me in a cellar for 3 days without food or water. Said I'd stay until I learned gratitude." The silence following her words is heavy with suppressed rage. "He won't take you back," Calder says finally, voice carrying absolute promise. "Whatever it costs, she won't take you again." Outside, wind carries the sound of approaching horses, and all of them know the talking has ended. Morning broke heavy with heat, the sky low and gray like a stretched-out bruise. Ilara moved quietly through her chores, her hands going through the motions feeding chickens, hauling water, but her mind was still back on that ridge, on him. She didn't know his name, didn't even know if he'd really seen her, or if he'd only looked past her like everyone else. But something about that moment stuck to her like wood smoke. It clung to her skin, to her thoughts, refusing to be scrubbed away. By midday, the town was buzzing. Word spread that a group of Sioux had been spotted near the riverbed. The blacksmith was already boarding up his windows. Pastor Evans canceled evening prayer. Nathan came home early, fuming about savages on our land, and sharpening the axe for no good reason. But Ilara knew. He was back. She couldn't explain how she knew, only that she did. So while the rest of town busied themselves with fear and shudders, Ilara climbed the ridge again. Her limp slowed her on the rocky path, but she kept going, breath ragged, skirt catching on brush. And there he was, alone this time, sitting atop a painted horse, still as stone, like he'd been waiting for her all morning. Ilara froze halfway up the slope, one hand gripping a tree for balance. The warrior raised his arm in greeting. Then, without a word, he dismounted. She watched him tie his horse to a low-hanging branch, then approach slowly, as if he knew not to spook her. His presence was quiet, grounded, not at all like the angry men of her town who filled a room with fists and noise. When he finally stood before her, he placed something in her hand. A necklace serifly carved from buffalo bone, strung with rawhide, simple yet precise. A gesture of peace. Ilara opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. He nodded once, then turned to leave, but paused. His voice, when it came, was deep and calm, thick with an accent but clear enough to understand. "Tokala," he said, tapping his chest. Then he pointed to her. She blinked, then said softly, "Ilara." He gave a small smile, almost imperceptible, then mounted his horse in one fluid motion and disappeared into the trees. She stood there long after he was gone, the necklace clenched tight in her palm, her breath caught between disbelief and something else. Something wild. Something alive. They cast her aside like broken glass, whispering that she'd never be wanted, never be loved until he rode in, lifted her from the dirt, and called her his bride. In his eyes, she wasn't a burden. She was the beginning of something sacred. They never said it outright, but Ilara knew. In every glance cast over her head, in every chore dumped at her feet, in every townswoman's whispered, pity-laced comment at the trading post, she knew exactly what they thought. Useless. She had been born with a crooked leg after a fever in childhood stole the strength from her bones. That was all it took. One limp, one flaw, one future gone. Now, at 23, while other girls had long since married, birthed children, and moved to farms of their own, Ilara was still scrubbing floors and hanging wet linens for her older brother Nathan and his bitter wife Ruth. She wasn't a daughter anymore, just extra hands they didn't want to admit they needed. They didn't beat her, didn't scream. They just erased her. She took what scraps of freedom she could. When the sun slanted just right and Ruth was busy pickling, Ilara would slip away up to the ridge overlooking the valley. That was the only place she could breathe her sanctuary of silence and sky. There, she'd sit in the grass with a bit of cloth and a blackened stick, sketching whatever the wind gave her, a bent tree, a bird overhead, the way the light spilled between clouds like spilled honey. She never expected company. But that day, something changed. She heard the hoofbeats before she saw them, a low, rhythmic thunder rolling over the ridge, too smooth to be cattle, too many to be a lone traveler. When she looked up, her breath caught. A line of Sioux warriors rode along the horizon, framed by sky and dust, silent, regal, eyes forward. The townspeople feared the Sioux, called them savage, dangerous. Ilara didn't move. She didn't feel fear only awe. Then one of them broke from the group. He was tall, with braided black hair, and the kind of posture that made the wind seem to pause. His horse carried him down the slope, slowly, directly toward her. She could have run, should have. But she stayed. The warrior stopped a few yards away, said nothing. Their eyes met. And in that brief moment, something ancient passed between them. No pity, not curiosity, recognition. He gave a single nod, a slow, deliberate gesture of respect, then turned and rode back to his brothers without a word. That night, Ilara didn't tell anyone, not Nathan, not Ruth. She just lay beneath her thin quilt, listening to the coyotes cry beyond the fields, and felt something she hadn't known in years. Not fear, no shame, hope. If you thought being left behind was painful, wait until you see what comes riding out of the mist. Morning broke heavy with heat, the sky low and gray like a stretched-out bruise. Ilara moved quietly through her chores, her hands going through the motions feeding chickens, hauling water, but her mind was still back on that ridge. On him. She didn't know his name. Didn't even know if he'd really seen her, or if he'd only looked past her like everyone else. But something about that moment stuck to her like wood smoke. It clung to her skin, to her thoughts, refusing to be scrubbed away. By midday, the town was buzzing. Word spread that a group of Sioux had been spotted near the riverbed. The blacksmith was already boarding up his windows, Pastor Evans canceled evening prayer. Nathan came home early, fuming about savages on our land, and sharpening the axe for no good reason. But Elara knew. He was back. She couldn't explain how she knew, only that she did. So while the rest of town busied themselves with fear and shudders, Elara climbed the ridge again. Her limp slowed her on the rocky path, but she kept going, breath ragged, skirt catching on brush. And there he was, alone this time, sitting atop a painted horse, still as stone, like he'd been waiting for her all morning. Elara froze halfway up the slope, one hand gripping a tree for balance. The warrior raised his arm in greeting. Then, without a word, he dismounted. She watched him tie his horse to a low-hanging branch, then approach slowly, as if he knew not to spook her. His presence was quiet, grounded, not at all like the angry men of her town who filled a room with fists and noise. When he finally stood before her, he placed something in her hand. A necklace ceremony carved from buffalo bone, strung with rawhide, simple yet precise. A gesture of peace. Elara opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. He nodded once, then turned to leave but paused. His voice, when it came, was deep and calm, thick with an accent but clear enough to understand. "Tokala," he said, tapping his chest. Then he pointed to her. She blinked, then said softly, "Elara." He gave a small smile, almost imperceptible, then mounted his horse in one fluid motion and disappeared into the trees. She stood there long after he was gone, the necklace clenched tight in her palm, her breath caught between disbelief and something else, something wild, something alive.